I'm Eleanor Davis, 67, retired school librarian with more stories than the books I used to shelve. Today I'm arriving at my son Kyle's 40th birthday party, carrying a homemade German chocolate cake, his childhood favorite. My heart sinks when I spot my ex-husband Richard and his wife Diane at the head table. The hostess guides me to a back corner, far from where I imagined I'd be seated. After decades of being overlooked despite my sacrifices, I shouldn't be surprised. Kyle catches my eye and shrugs. "Come on, Mom," he says. "You always like staying in the background. You're just back where you belong." Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments which state or country you call home. I grew up in a middle-class family in a small town just outside of Cincinnati. My father worked at the local bank, and my mother taught piano lessons from our living room. I was always the shy, bookish girl who preferred the company of fictional characters to real people. Not that I was antisocial, just quiet and observant. My parents encouraged my academic interests, and I excelled in school, particularly in literature and history. College was where I met Richard Davis. It was 1975, my sophomore year at Ohio State. I was studying library science, spending most evenings in the university library. Richard was in law school, tall, confident, with a booming laugh that turned heads. He was everything I wasn't: outgoing, popular, and commanding. When he first approached me in the reference section, I couldn't believe someone like him would notice someone like me. "You're always here," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. "I've been watching you for weeks." Instead of finding this creepy, my 20-year-old self was flattered. Richard had a way of making his intensity seem like devotion. Our courtship was brief but passionate. Within 6 months we were engaged, and by the following summer, we were married in a ceremony that was far grander than I would have chosen. Richard liked things to be noticed, to make impressions. I went along with it, believing that compromise was the foundation of marriage. I graduated with my degree in library science, and Richard finished law school the following year. We moved to Columbus, where he joined a promising firm, and I took a position at the public library. We were young, ambitious, and in love, or so I thought. When I became pregnant with Kyle in 1982, the dynamic of our relationship shifted. The pregnancy was difficult: months of severe morning sickness, bed rest for the final trimester, and a delivery that lasted 26 hours. Richard was at the hospital but spent most of the time in the waiting room or on the phone with clients. When Kyle was finally placed in my arms, I experienced a love so fierce and protective that it frightened me. "He's perfect," I whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes. Richard looked down at our son with pride but also a strange detachment. "He'll be a strong one," he said, already placing expectations on our newborn. I made the decision to switch to part-time work after Kyle was born. It wasn't what Richard wanted. He saw it as a lack of ambition, but I was determined to be present for our son's early years. Meanwhile, Richard's career as an attorney was taking off. He specialized in corporate law, working longer hours, networking at expensive restaurants, and traveling frequently. The pattern was established early. I was the stable, reliable parent while Richard was the exciting, intermittent one. When he came home from business trips, he'd bring extravagant gifts and take Kyle on adventures. I was the one who handled the fevers, the homework, the daily rituals that build a child's sense of security. Young Kyle adored his father with the uncomplicated love of a child who doesn't see the full picture. Richard was fun, dynamic, and rare qualities that made his presence special. I was constant, dependable, and always there, qualities that made me invisible. As Richard's career flourished, so did his ego. His subtle ways of diminishing my accomplishments became more pronounced. If I received recognition for a children's reading program I developed, Richard would say things like, "It's nice that your little library project went well," reducing my professional achievements to hobbies. When Kyle was 8, I organized a community book drive that collected over 10,000 books for underprivileged schools. The local newspaper wanted to interview me. "Why would they want to talk to you?" Richard asked, genuinely puzzled. "You're just doing what librarians do." Kyle, absorbing his father's attitudes, began to view my work and interests through the same dismissive lens. The library was boring, reading was okay, I guess, and staying home with Mom was nowhere near as exciting as going to the office with Dad. I told myself it didn't matter, that Kyle would appreciate me later, that Richard's dismissiveness was just his way. I convinced myself that putting my family first was the noble choice, even as I felt my own identity and dreams slipping away. By the time Kyle started middle school, I had become so accustomed to being overlooked that I stopped expecting anything else. I channeled my energies into being the best mother I could be, creating a warm home, and finding small ways to nurture my intellect through book clubs and continuing education courses in library science. What I didn't realize then was that I was teaching my son a terrible lesson, that it was acceptable to treat me as an afterthought, that my feelings and contributions didn't require acknowledgement or gratitude. It was a lesson that would come back to haunt me for decades. As Richard climbed the corporate ladder, eventually becoming a partner at his law firm in the early 1990s, the distance between us grew. Our home expanded. A larger house in a prestigious neighborhood, luxury cars, country club memberships. But our connection diminished. Richard was rarely home, and when he was distracted, irritable, or performing the role of successful provider for an audience that always seemed to include everyone but me. Kyle, by then a teenager, began to mirror his father's dismissive attitude toward me. When I'd ask about school or friends, I'd get monosyllabic responses. When Richard asked the same questions, Kyle would suddenly become animated, sharing details and seeking approval. It hurt, but I rationalized it as normal teenage behavior, a son identifying with his father. I tried to maintain my own identity through community work, joining the library board and volunteering with literacy programs. Richard viewed these activities as quaint distractions that kept me occupied while he did the real work of providing for the family. "It's cute that you're still so passionate about books," he said once, as if I were clinging to a childhood hobby instead of pursuing a meaningful career in community service. The first hint of Richard's affair came in the form of late nights at the office, weekend conferences, and a new attention to his appearance. He bought expensive cologne, updated his wardrobe, and started going to the gym regularly, changes that weren't for my benefit, as our physical relationship had dwindled to occasional, perfunctory encounters. I ignored the signs at first, not wanting to face what they might mean. But on a rainy Tuesday in April 1998, while searching for a receipt in Richard's jacket pocket, I found a hotel keycard with a lipstick smudge. That night, while Richard showered, I checked his phone and found dozens of text messages between him and his secretary, Diane. The messages were explicit, leaving no room for misinterpretation. They had been seeing each other for nearly a year. There were also cruel exchanges about me. Richard calling me boring, Diane laughing about my librarian clothes and mousy personality. Most painful were Richard's responses, "Can't wait to be free of her," and "Once Kyle's in college, I'm out." When I confronted Richard, his response wasn't denial but annoyance at being discovered. "What did you expect, Eleanor?" he said, not even bothering to look ashamed. "We haven't had a real marriage in years. Diane understands me. She's exciting, ambitious. She complements my life. And what am I?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Richard sighed, as if I were a child asking an obvious question. "You're Kyle's mother. That's the role you chose." The divorce was announced to Kyle just before his high school graduation. At 18, he was legally an adult but emotionally still very much a child when it came to his parents' relationship. I hoped for support or at least understanding from my son. Instead, Kyle sided firmly with his father. "Dad deserves to be happy," he told me, echoing Richard's own words. "You've always been so, I don't know, Mom, so bland, so content with less." The divorce proceedings were painful and unfair. Richard had resources I couldn't match. The best attorneys, financial advisors who helped him hide assets, and a judge who played golf at the same country club. I received the smaller of our two homes and a settlement that seemed substantial until you considered the lifestyle disparity it created. Richard kept the vacation properties, the majority of our investments, and, in many ways, the loyalty of our son. Within 6 months of our divorce being finalized, Richard married Diane. They moved into a new mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood in Columbus. Diane, 15 years younger than Richard and 20 years younger than me, slid seamlessly into the role of corporate wife and, to my ongoing heartbreak, surrogate mother to my adult son. Kyle started college that fall at his father's alma mater. During his undergraduate years, He came home to visit me occasionally, usually for brief, obligation-filled holidays. Meanwhile, Richard and Diane took him on lavish spring break trips to Europe and the Caribbean. His social media, which I checked compulsively despite how it hurt me, showed a young man living a charmed life, with frequent appearances by his father and stepmother but rarely any mention of me. I tried to maintain our connection through care packages, phone calls, and offers to visit him at school, but Kyle's responses were increasingly delayed and disinterested. When he did come home, he'd spend most of the time texting friends or complaining about how there was nothing to do in my neighborhood. "Dad and Diane are taking me to Paris next month," he announced during one holiday visit, not even looking up from his phone. "Diane says I need to experience real culture before I graduate." The implication that I couldn't provide real culture, despite my lifelong dedication to literature, art, and education, was a small cut added to thousands of others. But I smiled and said I hoped he'd have a wonderful time, because that's what mothers do. We swallow our pain and prioritize our children's happiness, even when they're the source of our heartache. The 22 years following my divorce from Richard were a study in persistence and heartbreak. I rebuilt my life piece by piece, returning to full-time work at the library and eventually becoming the head of the children's department. I found satisfaction in introducing young minds to the magic of reading, in creating safe spaces for children whose home lives might be chaotic, in being the kind of steadfast, nurturing presence I wished my own son still valued. My small circle of friends became my lifeline. My book club met every other Thursday in my living room. 5 women of similar age, all with their own stories of resilience. Ruth, a widow who'd raised 3 children on a teacher's salary, became my closest confidant. She understood what it meant to be both mother and father, to be taken for granted, to keep giving despite receiving little in return. "You're too good to him," Ruth would say whenever I mentioned Kyle's latest cancellation or dismissive comment. "He's a grown man now. You don't have to keep trying so hard." But I did keep trying. When Kyle graduated from college in 2004 and took a job at a marketing firm in Columbus, I attended the small celebration at Richard and Diane's home, where I was seated at a table with distant acquaintances while family members clustered around the important table. When Kyle met Jennifer at work a year later, I made every effort to welcome her, sending thoughtful gifts and invitations, even as Kyle limited our interactions. Their wedding in 2007 was another exercise in humility. Richard and Diane spared no expense, turning it into a showcase of their wealth and social connections. I contributed what I could financially, but my primary role seemed to be staying out of the way. The mother-son dance, traditionally a special moment, was cut short when Richard interrupted to make an impromptu speech about passing the torch to his new daughter-in-law. The birth of my grandchildren should have been a time of joy and connection, but even this was complicated by the dynamics Richard and Diane had established. Madeline was born in 2011, and Noah followed in 2014. I was allowed to visit them in the hospital but was asked to come at specific, limited times that didn't overlap with Richard and Diane's visits. As my grandchildren grew, I cherished every moment with them but was acutely aware of the disparity in our relationships compared to their other grandparents. Richard and Diane took them to Disney World, bought them expensive gifts, and were featured prominently in family photos. I read them stories, baked cookies with them, and tried to create meaningful memories on a much smaller budget. "Grandma Eleanor doesn't have a pool like Grandma Diane," I overheard Madeline telling a friend during a rare visit to my home. The comment wasn't malicious, just a child's observation of an obvious truth, but it stung nonetheless. Despite the emotional toll, I continued to make sacrifices for Kyle and his family. When he decided to leave his marketing job and start his own firm in 2016, I offered financial support without hesitation. I took out a home equity loan and gave him $50,000, nearly half of my retirement savings, to help with startup costs. Richard and Diane contributed as well, of course, but their contribution came with prominent mention in the company materials and a position for Diane on the advisory board. My contribution came with a thank you call and then silence. When the business struggled in its second year, I sent another $25,000 without being asked, having to downsize my home to a smaller condominium to make it possible. Kyle accepted the money with a brief thanks and an explanation that he was too busy to talk much. 6 months later, when the company began to turn a profit, Kyle took Richard and Diane on a celebratory trip to Napa Valley. I received a bottle of wine with a pre-printed card. Through all of this, I maintained hope that things would change, that Kyle would eventually see the imbalance and make efforts to correct it. I told myself that he was just busy, just stressed, just trying to impress his father. I made excuses for him the way mothers do, finding explanations for behavior that, had it come from anyone else, I would have recognized as simply unkind. Every few months, Kyle would reach out with increased warmth, usually when he needed something, advice about the children, help with childcare during a busy period, or most frequently money for some new venture or expense. I always responded immediately, grateful for any connection, any chance to be needed. "You're the only one who really gets it, Mom," he'd say during these moments of need, temporarily elevating me from afterthought to essential. "Dad just throws money at problems, but you actually listen." I'd feel a surge of validation, followed inevitably by the crash of reality when, needs met, Kyle would retreat once again to the orbit of Richard and Diane's more glamorous world. Through it all, I kept a meticulous record of every contribution, every sacrifice, every moment of joy and disappointment. Not as ammunition, but as a private reminder to myself that my love, while perhaps undervalued, was real and substantial. The small leather journal I kept in my bedside drawer chronicled 22 years of steady, unconditional love, the kind that asks for nothing but secretly hopes for everything. I never imagined that this private accounting would eventually become public, or that the accumulated weight of all those unacknowledged sacrifices would finally become too heavy to bear. Kyle's call came on a Wednesday afternoon in early April. I was sorting through spring donations at the library, preparing for our annual book sale, when my phone lit up with his name. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone I'd come to recognize, warm but slightly hurried, the way he sounded when he wanted something. "I'm planning my 40th birthday next month. Nothing huge, just family and close friends at Giovanni's. I'd love for you to be there." Giovanni's was one of the most expensive restaurants in Columbus, known for its exclusive private dining rooms and celebrity chef. My heart lifted at the invitation. It had been nearly 6 months since I'd seen Kyle and the grandchildren, apart from a brief Christmas Eve visit. "Of course I'll be there, sweetheart," I said, already mentally rearranging my schedule. "Just tell me the date and time." "Great," Kyle replied, and then hesitated. "There's just one thing. The private room has a minimum spend that's pretty steep. Dad and Diane are covering part, but I was wondering if you might be able to chip in? Say $2,000. I know it's a lot, but it would really help make this special." The amount represented nearly 3 months of discretionary income for me, but I agreed without hesitation. "I'd be happy to help, Kyle. It's an important birthday." "You're the best, Mom," he said, his voice warming further. "Oh, and one more thing, would you mind making that German chocolate cake? The one you used to make for my birthdays when I was a kid? No one makes it like you do." The request touched me deeply. That cake, 3 layers of rich chocolate with coconut pecan frosting, had been a tradition throughout Kyle's childhood. I'd made it every year until he turned 16 and announced he'd prefer store-bought ice cream cake, like normal kids. "I'd love to make your cake," I said, emotion catching in my throat. "Just like old times." After we hung up, I sat in my office feeling a renewed sense of hope. This invitation, the request for the cake, they felt like acknowledgments of my place in Kyle's life, small recognitions of our shared history that Richard and Diane couldn't claim. The weeks before the party were filled with careful preparations. I sent Kyle the money immediately, transferring it from my vacation fund. I could postpone my planned trip to visit Ruth in Arizona. I experimented with the cake recipe, making practice versions to ensure it would be perfect. I hadn't baked it in decades, and I wanted it to match Kyle's memory. The gift required even more consideration. I wanted something meaningful, something that spoke to our connection. After much thought, I decided on my father's pocket watch, a Hamilton from the 1940s with an inscription from my grandfather. It was one of the few valuable things I owned, both monetarily and sentimentally. My father had carried it throughout his life, and it had been passed to me when he died. I'd always intended for Kyle to have it eventually, and this milestone birthday seemed the perfect occasion. I had the watch professionally cleaned and restored, spending another significant sum to replace the worn leather case with a handcrafted wooden box lined with velvet. I wrote a card explaining the watch's history, how it had timed the important moments of my father's life, and now could do the same for Kyle's. The day before the party, I spent hours getting ready. I had my hair done at a salon, a rare indulgence, and splurged on a new dress, a deep blue sheath that the salesperson assured me was both elegant and contemporary. I wanted to look my best, to fit into the upscale environment of Giovanni's, to make Kyle proud to introduce me as his mother. The morning of the party, I carefully packaged the cake in a special carrier and placed the watch box in my purse. The drive to the restaurant was filled with anticipation and nervous energy. This felt important, a chance to reconnect, to establish a new, more balanced relationship with my adult son. When I arrived at Giovanni's, the valet took my 15-year-old sedan with a barely concealed smirk, glancing past me to the Mercedes pulling up behind. I carried the cake carefully through the ornate entryway, where I spotted Kyle greeting guests in the lobby. His face lit up when he saw me, or perhaps it was just the cake he was happy to see. Either way, he came forward and gave me a quick hug. "You made it. And you brought the cake. It looks amazing, Mom." "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said, holding the hug a moment longer than he seemed comfortable with. 40 years. I can hardly believe it. Kyle introduced me to a few colleagues I hadn't met before. Then his attention was pulled away by the arrival of more guests. Jennifer approached with Madeline and Noah, who gave me enthusiastic hugs before being distracted by other children in attendance. "It's good to see you, Eleanor," Jennifer said with genuine warmth. She had always been kind to me, even if she did seem intimidated by Richard and Diane. "The kids have been looking forward to seeing you." As we chatted, I noticed the hostess approaching with a concerned expression. "Mrs. Davis?" she asked, looking between Jennifer and me. "I'm Eleanor Davis," I clarified. "Oh," she said, checking her tablet. "You're at table 7. If you'll follow me." I glanced at Jennifer, who looked uncomfortable. "I'm sure there's been a mistake," I said to the hostess. "I'm the mother of the birthday celebrant." The hostess looked at her tablet again. "I have Eleanor Davis assigned to table 7. The immediate family is at the head table." She gestured toward the front of the private dining room, where I could see Richard and Diane already seated near an empty chair obviously reserved for Kyle. Even more surprising was the small dog bed placed near the table, where Apollo, Richard and Diane's pampered Pomeranian, was already settled. The dog had a better position than I did. "There must be some confusion," I said, my voice steady despite my rising distress. "Perhaps you could check with Kyle." But as I looked for my son, I saw him watching the interaction from across the room. Our eyes met, and he gave a small shrug before turning away to greet more arriving guests. That's when I knew. This wasn't a mistake. This was exactly how things were meant to be. Table 7 was positioned in the far corner of the private dining room, beside the service entrance where servers bustled in and out with trays and dishes. My table mates were Jennifer's elderly aunt whom I'd never met, a couple who worked with Kyle but were clearly too junior to merit better placement, and 2 empty seats that remained unoccupied throughout the evening. From this vantage point, I had a clear view of the head table, where Kyle sat with Richard and Diane on either side, followed by Jennifer and the children, and several of Kyle's closest friends. They were laughing, toasting, caught in the golden spotlight that the restaurant had literally positioned above their table, while the rest of the room remained in more subdued lighting. I placed my cake on the designated dessert table, where it looked homely and out of place next to an elaborate multi-tiered creation from an upscale bakery. Clearly Richard and Diane's contribution. A small card in front of the professional cake read, "Happy 40th birthday, Kyle. Love, Dad and Diane." My cake had no card because I hadn't thought one necessary. The cake itself was the message, a mother's love in edible form. As the evening progressed, I made valiant attempts to engage with the family. During the cocktail hour, I approached Madeline and Noah, who were excited to tell me about their recent school activities. But our conversation was cut short when Diane called them over to meet the restaurant owner, who was apparently a personal friend. "Sorry, Grandma Eleanor," Noah said with the innocent honesty of a 7-year-old. "Grandma Diane says it's important to meet influential people." I tried to join a conversation with Jennifer and some of the other guests, but found myself awkwardly positioned on the periphery, unable to hear properly over the restaurant's ambient noise. When I finally managed to approach Kyle, he was distracted, checking his phone and scanning the room. "The party seems to be going well," I offered. "Everyone looks like they're having a good time." "Yeah, it's great," Kyle replied, barely making eye contact. "Hey, I need to greet the Sullivans. They just arrived. We'll catch up later, okay?" Later never came. When dinner was served, I returned to my assigned table, watching as the head table was served first with special attention from the chef himself. Our table received our meals last, and by then my appetite had diminished considerably. The gift-opening portion of the evening was equally painful. Kyle sat at the head table with Jennifer beside him, opening presents while a friend recorded the process for social media. Richard and Diane's gift was presented first, a set of keys to a new boat, which Kyle accepted with genuine emotion, embracing both of them as the room applauded. Other substantial gifts followed: expensive watches, rare bottles of scotch, weekend getaways. My gift remained in my purse. Somehow, the moment to present it never materialized, and as I watched Kyle's reactions to the increasingly extravagant presents, I began to doubt whether my sentimental offering would be appreciated at all. After the gifts, it was time for dessert. The professional cake was wheeled out with fanfare, sparklers blazing atop it as the room sang "Happy Birthday." My cake remained on the side table, uncut and unacknowledged. As coffee was being served, I finally gathered my courage and approached the head table, determined to at least wish my son a proper happy birthday and perhaps find a private moment to give him the watch. Kyle looked up as I approached, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he masked it with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mom, hey, are you enjoying yourself?" Before I could answer, Noah tugged at Kyle's sleeve. "Dad, why is Grandma Eleanor sitting all the way over there? Even Apollo gets to sit up front." An uncomfortable silence fell over the immediate area. Kyle cleared his throat, looking embarrassed not by the situation but by his son's question. "Apollo is Grandpa Richard's emotional support animal," he explained with forced lightness. "And Grandma Eleanor is sitting with other guests." "But she's your mom," Madeline pointed out with a child's unerring logic. Kyle glanced at me, then around at the watching guests, and made a decision that would change our relationship forever. "Come on, Mom," he said with a dismissive laugh that was clearly meant to diffuse the awkwardness for everyone except me. "You always like staying in the background. You're just back where you belong." The words hit me like a physical blow. Around the table, there were a few uncomfortable chuckles, a few averted eyes. Richard didn't bother hiding his smirk. Diane patted Kyle's arm approvingly. In that moment, something crystallized within me, a clarity I had been avoiding for decades. This was who my son had become, or perhaps who he had always been, shaped by his father's example and his stepmother's influence. This was the reality of my place in his life. An afterthought, a background character, useful for financial contributions and homemade cakes but not worthy of a seat at the table. I didn't respond to Kyle's comment. Instead, I reached into my purse and withdrew the small wooden box containing the pocket watch. Without a word, I placed it on the table beside him. "What's this?" Kyle asked, already reaching for the next card from the pile of gifts. "Just a small token," I said quietly. "I should be going. Thank you for inviting me." As I turned to leave, I heard the box being opened behind me. I didn't look back, but I felt the sudden silence that fell over the room. A silence that followed me all the way to the valet stand, where I waited for my car with as much dignity as I could muster. The drive home was a blur of tears and revelation. Decades of memories flashed through my mind. All the times I had made excuses for Kyle's behavior, all the sacrifices that had gone unacknowledged, all the hope I had invested in a relationship that consistently delivered disappointment. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the anger I had suppressed for so long. Not just at Kyle but at Richard, at Diane, and most of all at myself for permitting this pattern, for teaching my son that it was acceptable to treat me as less than, for believing that unconditional love meant accepting mistreatment. As I pulled into my driveway, I made a decision that had been 40 years in the making. Things were going to change. I was going to change. The time for background living was over. The silence from Kyle's family was deafening in the weeks following the birthday party. No calls, no texts, not even the usual pictures of the grandchildren that Jennifer would occasionally send. I didn't reach out either. For the first time in our relationship, I wasn't the one trying to bridge the gap. Instead, I channeled my energy into action. The morning after the party, I contacted a real estate agent about selling my condominium. I met with a financial advisor to reassess my retirement options. I joined a writing group at the library, something I'd wanted to do for years, but had always put off in favor of being available for Kyle and the grandchildren. 3 weeks after the party, my phone finally rang with Jennifer's number. I hesitated before answering, unsure if I was ready for whatever justifications or explanations might be coming. Eleanor. Jennifer's voice was tentative. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. Of course, I said, keeping my tone neutral. How are you, Jennifer? We're all. She faltered. Eleanor, I owe you an apology. We all do. The way you were treated at the party was awful. I should have said something. Her honesty was unexpected and touching. Thank you for saying that, I replied. There was a pause before Jennifer continued. The note you left with the watch. Kyle read it after you left. Everyone did. I've never seen a room go so quiet. I closed my eyes, remembering what I'd written in that moment of clarity before the party. The note had detailed not just the history of the watch but also a brief accounting of my contributions to Kyle's life, the financial support I provided for his business, the education fund I'd established for the grandchildren, the many times I'd rearranged my life to accommodate his needs. It wasn't meant as a guilt trip, but as a simple statement of facts that I realized he had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. I didn't write that note to hurt him, I said carefully. I just thought it was time for transparency. It was a wake-up call, Jennifer admitted. Kyle hasn't been the same since. He keeps taking out the watch and reading the note. Richard and Diane have been calling constantly, but he's not answering them either. I wasn't sure how to respond to this. Part of me, the mother who had always protected Kyle from consequences, wanted to rush in and smooth things over. But the new Eleanor, the one who had finally found her voice, knew better. Kyle is an adult, I said finally. He needs to process this in his own way. He wants to see you, Jennifer said. When you're ready. No pressure, but he has some thinking to do. After we hung up, I sat with my thoughts for a long time. The ball was in my court now. An unfamiliar position. I decided to give both Kyle and myself some space before agreeing to a meeting. This wasn't a situation that could be resolved quickly over coffee. In the meantime, I accelerated my plans for change. My condominium sold within 2 weeks, and I used the proceeds to purchase a small but charming cottage in a coastal town in North Carolina. Ruth had relocated there a few years earlier, and the prospect of being near my closest friend was appealing. The library where I worked was understanding about my retirement, even organizing a touching farewell party where I was surprised by how many lives I had apparently touched through my work. The process of downsizing was liberating. Each item I donated or sold felt like releasing a piece of my past. The new cottage would be furnished with only things that brought me joy or served a purpose. No more keeping spaces ready for visitors who rarely came. No more maintaining appearances for a life I wasn't actually living. I was packing the last boxes when Kyle finally called directly. Mom, he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Jennifer said you're moving? To North Carolina. Yes, I confirmed. I close on the cottage next week. It's a lovely little place, just a short walk from the beach. But why didn't you tell me? There was a note of accusation in his tone that would have sent the old Eleanor into apologetic backpedaling. I'm telling you now, I said calmly. It's something I've been considering for a while. The silence on his end spoke volumes. Kyle was experiencing what I had felt countless times. The realization that significant decisions were being made without his input or even awareness. Can we talk before you go? He asked finally. Please? I've been doing a lot of thinking and I need to see you. We agreed to meet at a neutral location. A coffee shop halfway between our homes. When I arrived, Kyle was already there, looking more disheveled than I'd seen him in years. The confident, polished marketing executive had been replaced by someone who appeared to have missed several nights of sleep. He stood when he saw me, an automatic gesture of respect that felt new. Mom, thank you for coming. We ordered coffee and found a quiet table in the corner. Kyle kept turning his cup in his hands, struggling to begin. I've been carrying Grandpa's watch, he said finally, patting his pocket. Every day since the party. I had it appraised. Did you know how valuable it is? Its value isn't monetary, I replied. It's in the history it carries. Kyle nodded, his eyes damp. I read your note so many times I've memorized it. I had no idea about some of those things, the second loan for my business, selling your vacation house to help with our down payment. You never said anything. Would it have mattered if I had? I asked gently. His face crumpled with shame. I don't know. I want to say yes, but I don't know who I've become, Mom. At the party when I saw you standing there after what I'd said. The look on your face. He broke off, struggling to maintain composure. I've been thinking about all the times I've treated you as an afterthought, all the times I've taken you for granted. It's not who I want to be. I share responsibility for this pattern, I said after a moment. I taught you that it was acceptable to treat me as less than. I never established boundaries or expectations. Don't do that, Kyle said, looking up sharply. Don't make excuses for me. I'm 40 years old. I've been making my own choices. We talked for nearly 3 hours, digging into painful truths and old wounds. Kyle spoke about his complicated relationship with Richard, how he'd spent his life seeking approval from a man who measured worth in status and success. I shared my own regrets about the divorce, about not being stronger, about allowing Kyle to be caught in the middle. I want to change this, Kyle said as our conversation wound down. I want my children to see a different example. I don't want Madeline and Noah thinking it's okay to discard people who love them. Change takes time, I cautioned. And consistency. Will you give me that time? Kyle asked, vulnerability naked on his face. Even from North Carolina? I reached across the table and took his hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. I'll always be your mother, Kyle. That doesn't change with geography. But our relationship needs to change. As I drove away from that meeting, I felt lighter than I had in decades. Not because everything was resolved. It wasn't and wouldn't be for some time. But because I had finally spoken my truth and been heard. The pocket watch had served its purpose. Not as a gift but as a mirror, reflecting back the reality of our relationship in a way that could no longer be ignored. The move to North Carolina marked the beginning of my new life. The cottage, with its weathered shingles and wraparound porch, became a sanctuary. I filled it with books, comfortable furniture, and art that spoke to me. I joined the local library as a volunteer, started taking long walks on the beach every morning, and enrolled in a creative writing course at the community college. For the first time in my adult life, I was putting myself first, not out of selfishness but out of self-respect. And strangely, almost magically, this shift seemed to be having a positive effect on my relationship with Kyle. Our weekly phone calls became more meaningful, less perfunctory. When he and Jennifer brought the children to visit that summer, the dynamics were noticeably different, more balanced, more considerate. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching the sunset while the children built sandcastles on the beach below, Kyle turned to me with a thoughtful expression. You know what's strange, he said. I think I respect you more now that you're not constantly available to me. That's messed up, isn't it? I smiled, watching the orange glow of the setting sun transform the water. Not messed up. Just human. We often value what we fear losing. Kyle nodded slowly. I almost lost you, didn't I? Not physically, but I almost lost my mother. But you didn't, I said softly. And that's what matters now. 6 months into my new life in coastal North Carolina, I barely recognized the woman I'd been before. My small cottage had become exactly what I'd hoped, a true reflection of myself, filled with books, colorful throw pillows, and artwork from local artists. The garden was coming along nicely, with native plants that thrived in the sandy soil and salt air. Most mornings found me walking along the shore as the sun rose, collecting shells and watching dolphins arc through the waves. I developed new friendships through my volunteer work at the library and my writing group. Ruth and I had weekly dinner dates where we tried new recipes and shared stories. At 67, I was discovering parts of myself that had been dormant for decades: my love of photography, my interest in local history, my surprisingly decent talent for watercolor painting. Kyle's attempts to rebuild our relationship had been consistent and thoughtful. He called regularly, not just when he needed something. He sent unprompted updates about the children and his work. Most significantly, he listened when I spoke, really listened, instead of waiting for his turn to talk. Richard and Diane had apparently been less than pleased with this evolution. According to Jennifer, who had become a more frequent and honest correspondent, there had been several tense conversations about Kyle's unhealthy guilt and how I was manipulating him emotionally. Kyle had stood his ground, even going so far as to reduce contact with his father when Richard's criticisms of me became too pointed. When my birthday arrived in April, I received a package from Columbus. Inside was a leather-bound photo album filled with pictures I'd never seen. Kyle's childhood, adolescence, and adult life, with particular emphasis on moments I'd been present for but never properly documented. The final pages held recent photos of Madeline and Noah holding signs that read, "We miss you, Grandma Eleanor," and, "When are you visiting us?" The accompanying card read, "Mom, I've been going through old photos and realized how few we have together, despite you being there for every important moment of my life. I'm working on changing that. Happy birthday. All my love, Kyle." It was a thoughtful gift that acknowledged the past while looking toward the future. Exactly the kind of awareness I'd hoped Kyle might develop. As spring turned to summer, Kyle, Jennifer, and the children arranged to spend 2 weeks with me. They rented a larger beach house nearby, giving us plenty of opportunity to be together without the pressure of constant proximity. It was during this visit that I truly began to see the changes in Kyle. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching the sunset, Kyle brought up the pocket watch. "I've been thinking about what it represents," he said, taking it from his pocket where he still carried it daily. "Not just family history but time itself, how we choose to spend it, who we choose to spend it with." I nodded, watching as he opened the case to reveal the elegant timepiece inside. "I wasted so much time trying to impress Dad," Kyle continued, "chasing his approval, adopting his values. I never realized what it was costing me, what it was costing us. We can't get that time back," I said gently. "But we have now, and whatever comes next." Kyle closed the watch case carefully. "I want you to know that things are different with Madeline and Noah. I'm making sure they understand what matters. Real connection, not appearances or status. Jennifer and I talk about it all the time." Later that week, we had a family dinner at my cottage. I'd prepared a simple meal of local seafood and vegetables from my garden. As we ate, Noah asked if I would tell stories about when his dad was little. "Your grandmother is the keeper of our family history," Kyle said, giving me a meaningful look. "She remembers everything I've forgotten or never appreciated at the time." That night, after everyone had gone back to their rental, I sat on my porch alone, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The painful birthday party that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning, the catalyst for change I hadn't known I needed. I thought about the women in my writing group, many of whom had shared similar stories of invisibility within their own families. I thought about the younger library volunteers who sought my advice about relationships and boundaries. I realized that my experience, painful as it had been, might serve as both warning and inspiration to others. That night, I began writing what would eventually become a memoir titled The Background Mother: Finding Your Voice After a Lifetime of Silence. The process of documenting my journey was healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Each chapter helped me make sense of my choices, forgive myself for my mistakes, and celebrate my eventual awakening. When the book was completed a year later, I hesitated before sharing the manuscript with Kyle. Would he see it as a betrayal, a public airing of family laundry? But in keeping with our new commitment to honesty, I sent it to him with a note explaining that this was my story, my truth, and while he featured prominently, it was ultimately about my journey. His response came a week later. A long, thoughtful email that brought tears to my eyes. "I recognize the mother in these pages," he wrote, "and I recognize the son selfish, entitled, blind to his own privilege. It wasn't easy to read, but it was necessary. I'm proud of you for writing this, for claiming your story. If publishing it helps even one person avoid our mistakes or find their voice, then it's worth any discomfort I might feel. You have my full support." The memoir found a small but appreciative audience when it was published. I began receiving letters from women, and some men, who saw themselves in my story. People who had spent years in the background of their own lives, who were finding the courage to step forward and demand recognition. Richard, predictably, was furious about the book, though I doubt he actually read it. Through Kyle, I heard rumors of legal threats and denunciations, but nothing came of them. The truth, simply told, was its own defense. As for Diane, she and I would never be friends, but time and distance had reduced her from villain to simply another flawed human in my story. In my more charitable moments, I could even recognize that she had been shaped by the same patriarchal expectations that had influenced my own choices, just in different ways. Today, as I look out at the ocean from my porch, I feel a sense of peace that once seemed impossible. At nearly 70, I've discovered that it's never too late to rewrite your role in your own life, to set boundaries, to demand respect, to prioritize your own happiness. Kyle and his family visit regularly now. Our relationship isn't perfect. We still have moments of tension and misunderstanding, but it's authentic in a way it never was before. The grandchildren are growing up seeing a grandmother who values herself, who speaks her truth, who lives a life of purpose and joy. The pocket watch sits on my mantle these days, returned to me by Kyle as a symbol of our shared history and changing future. "You keep it for now," he told me. "I want you to see how I'm using the time we have left, making it count, making it right." I often wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed in that restaurant, accepted my place at the back table, swallowed my hurt as I had so many times before. The path of least resistance is seductive in its familiarity, but the path of growth, while painful, leads to vistas I could never have imagined. If you're watching this and see yourself in my story, if you've been relegated to the background of your own life, know that it's never too late to step forward into the light. Your voice matters. Your feelings matter. You matter. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved to preserve your self-respect? What helped you find the courage to make that change? Please like and subscribe if this story resonated with you, and share it with someone who might need to hear that they deserve a seat at the table. Thank you for listening, and remember, the supporting characters in other people's lives can always become the protagonists of their own.